Woman who will tell you that women are too emotional to take the stress of business. It's a woman who will tell you that a woman can't have it all. Why? Because they've learned it well. The blacks are the ones who told blacks at the time of the Civil War, you don't want to leave this here plantation. We got us a good massa. You can't make it out there. You black boy, you can't make it out there. It's a woman who has learned self-hatred. Why did the blacks burn Watts? Because there's so much self-hatred in an oppressed people that they're very likely to turn on themselves. Do you follow what I'm saying? So until we learn to love ourselves, until we begin to see the falsity of these images, until we change from inside, not much is going to change outside. When it's women who stop saying, you have to be very patient. I mean, do you realize, Joan, that if you say those things, do you understand that men are going to leave here tonight threatened and angry? My heart bleeds. It does. My heart bleeds. But there's nothing I can do about that. There's nothing I can do about that. They said to Martin Luther King, why don't you talk to whites? And Martin Luther King said, my job is not to convert whites. My job is to conscientionize the black. It is women who must understand the value of women. It's women who must own their own qualities, and it is women who must require them of the world around them, in their backyard, in their families, at the dinner table, at the job, in the office. You follow what I'm saying? It's a deeply attitudinal thing. My friends, you have been very patient tonight. This has gone on. I'd be happy to stay with anybody who wants to stay, but I want to give the rest of the people a chance to get out and call their psychiatrist. I just remind you of one thing. The Chinese say, nothing we do changes the past, but everything we do changes the future. Do something, some little thing. Change the world for your daughters. Thank you.
Sister Joan, on behalf of the audience, first of all, and the university, and the Sisters of Charity in particular, I would like to express our deepest gratitude for, I guess, a moving presentation. And we certainly look forward to pursuing this tomorrow. Before I leave frustrated and angry, I would remind you that the lectures continue tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in this same place, and tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock in this place. And any of you and all of you who wish to meet Sister Joan, have coffee with us or whatever, or some pleasant conversation, just go out that door, turn left to room 405, the faculty lounge, and enjoy yourselves. See you tomorrow.
Joan. This morning I'm just going to refer you to the back of your brochure, although I think we ran out of them. But if you have access to one, there you will see a list or a description of Sister Joan's qualifications and her achievements and her concerns. But those of us who were fortunate enough to be here last evening know that that brochure simply tells us about Sister Joan. You have to experience Sister Joan in order to know her and to know the depths of her concerns. And so this morning, without any further ado, I invite Sister Joan to continue her theme of new questions for new times by addressing the topic, A New Theology of Eve. Welcome, Sister Joan.
Gosh, I really thought it'd be just me and God and Betty this morning. I never get to this part of a series that I'm not smart enough to remember something my dad tried to teach me at a very early age. My dad and I were great football fans together, and I can remember him telling me about a story about Johnny Unitas. Now, you remember Johnny Unitas? He was the quarterback for the Baltimore Colts, and they had this phenomenal rivalry with the Los Angeles Rams. And my dad told me about the time when, after a particularly grueling first half, Johnny Unitas walked in to the locker room, bent over his sink beside his locker, looked into the mirror, touched his bruised and bleeding face very tenderly, looked himself straight in the eye and said, "There has got to be an easier way for me to meet congenial people my own age." Just invite me to a party. I'm willing. Does not have to be little Tommy Tucker. Can sing for your supper. I want to look this morning at a set of questions that comes off of a lack of synthesis between two positions. The first position is stated by Anais Nin. She says, "We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are." And the other side of that position is Aristotle's. Aristotle says, femaleness is a deformity that affects half the human race. My question this morning is, which perspective is correct? From which point of view should we be looking at femaleness in this church and this society at this time? Have women been seen correctly by men? Do women see themselves correctly? Do we need a new perspective? Well, again, I never speak to groups without holding particular women in my heart. So the first woman that I remember very well is a little girl taught catechism by our sisters down in one of the outlying parishes. And you know those old catechism classes, how they went, sister came in on Sunday morning, drilled something into the kid's head, didn't see him again for 7 days, came back 7 days later and said, "Tell sister what we taught last week." So on the first Sunday, sister taught the creation story. And on the second Sunday, she went back and said to the class, "Now, who remembers what we said about the creation story?" The girl in the back said, I do, sister, I do." So finally, you couldn't turn this kid off, and sister said, "All right, Mary Ellen, you tell the class what you remember about creation." The little kid said, "Well, sister," she said, "on the first day, God made stars and light. And God looked at stars and light, and God said, 'Oh, boy, is that good.' And on the second day, God made the trees and the fishes. And God said, 'Boy, I done good.' And on the third day, God made all the animals. And God said, 'Them animals are really good.' And then on the next day, God made Adam. And God said, 'I can do better than that.' And then God made Eve. But there's another woman from a religious tradition who has touched my heart very deeply. The Sufi tell the story of a rug exporter who traveled from bazaar to bazaar through the Middle East, collecting rugs for export. And one day he rode up in front of a very small stall where an old woman sat on her prayer rug in front of one rug. And the collector shouted, "Old woman, is that rug behind you for sale?" The old woman stayed wrapped in prayer, never raised her head. Said, "Yes, sir, that rug's for sale." "So what do you want for that rug?" She said, her head still down. 100 rupees, sir." He said, 100 rupee for that rug? She said, "Absolutely, sir." He said, "Old lady, of all the rugs in all the stalls, in all the bazaars of the Middle East, I have never seen a rug as beautiful as yours." She said, "I know that, sir. That's why I'm asking 100 rupee and not a single rupee less." And he said, "In the name of Allah, woman, if you know the beauty of your rug, then why are you selling it for only 100 rupee?" And for the first time in the conversation, the old lady's head came up and she looked him straight in the eye and she said, "Because, sir, until this very moment, I never knew that there were any numbers beyond 100. Now, I'm here to tell you that women all over this globe are discovering that there are numbers beyond 100 for them too, and they will never sell themselves for less again. The question today is, why would there even be a question? The answer, I believe, is the Eve story. And the solution is, it's retelling our own re-immersion in it. Henry Rowland wrote once, "Woman is the peg on which the wit hangs his jest, the preacher his text, the cynic his grouch, and the sinner his justification." Worse yet, literature is confirmed by experience. Woman has clearly become the most insulted member of the human race. Not quite intelligent, not quite useful, not quite virtuous, not quite approved, even by God. Nevertheless, it is hard to imagine any woman who has been scorned more often or rejected more universally than the woman Eve. Men have heaped disdain on her as enemy of the human race, and women have despised her for the weakness they see in her as having been bred in them as well. And judging from the basic shame that surrounds Eve throughout history, in the art of every people, in the theology of every Christian church, in the hearts of every new and even more distant generation from her, the campaign of derision and contempt has been almost universally successful. The cause of human suffering is the woman Eve. The fundamentalist theology of sin insists. And therefore, women in general are to be punished, avoided, controlled, pitied, mocked, and feared. It's a devastating rationale. And it has kept women out of public arenas, out of intellectual centers, out of ecclesiastical holy places, and out of touch with themselves for eons. That simple theological rationale, that rationale theologized, has kept women down and kept them quiet and kept them in bondage forever. Eve was not to be trusted, and neither were they. Eve was out of control, and so were they. Eve was a danger to the proper order of society, and so were they. But the picture of Eve, the temptress, that has served sexism so well for so long, if you look at it squarely and you look at it deeply and you look at it consciously and you look at it freely, and without the formulas and the fictions and the filters of the past, you can see that that picture of Eve is an unkind one to men as well. Why? Because if woman is by nature a calculating temptress who requires control, then man, who fell to her simpering, sickening little wiles without so much as a whimper, is also then by nature apparently anemic, unthinking, sniveling weakling who doesn't qualify to be in charge of anything. Why is the portrait that they draw of Eve as much a portrait of Adam? Because if Eve is the enemy who took him down with a simple, empty-headed, vacuous, inviting smile, come on, honey, have a bite, then a man by nature is too easily duped, isn't he? To be responsible for important things. He's far too embarrassingly gullible. His willpower is far too essentially flabby. He's a wimp at the mercy of the weakest of opponents. You simply can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. The philosophical problem is very clear. It's just that it is never publicly, consciously, honestly admitted. Either Adam was rebellious, and so was Eve, or Eve was god-awful weak, and so was Adam. It's not a pretty picture. It doesn't sound to me like creation at its best. And God saw these two empty-headed creatures and said, boy, I done good on that one. It doesn't sound to me like what Scripture means to describe when it reads, on the seventh day, God made humans, and God said, that is good. Good. Both of them. Not one good and one best, let alone one good and one not. No, there must be more to Eve than what we have been allowed, given, enabled, empowered, taught to see. Or there is far less to Adam as well than we have been led to believe. The fact is that Eve, no less than Adam, is the glory of God. Eve is the glory of God. And Adam, no less than Eve, is the sign of humanity becoming deeply, dearly, beautifully, painfully, wondrously human. Indeed, the 21st century sorely needs a fuller picture of Eve in a world where the loss of respect for the feminine dimension of life has brought us to the brink of our own extermination and the most organized brutality in the history of humankind, and a control of the goods of the earth that leaves 2/3 of the children of the earth deprived, underdeveloped, and dispossessed, and a control over women that brings with it this morning bride burnings in India, 80 million clitoridectomies in Africa, one of them pictured and documented in the September 27th issue of Newsweek magazine. Exploitative labor practices in the United States and Canada, and consequently, rape hotels in Bosnia. Rape hotels in Bosnia about which no cleric, no pope, no politician screamed in pain or walked in the streets or gave nearly as much attention to as they did the great theological debate over altar girls or the admission of women to male golf courses. Rape hotels in Bosnia that they all took for granted while they worried themselves sick about the use of condoms. Consequently, ecclesiastical invisibility everywhere in the world. Clearly, the human race cannot survive either as human and perhaps not at all without a total commitment, genuine, real, and demonstrated, to the value of the feminine in our midst. But you see, in order to come to that, it's the story of Eve. It is Eve. It is Eve that must be reclaimed if humanity is ever to be completely whole, if anything is ever really to change for women. If women in general, not privileged tokens only, but fully human beings, are ever to take their rightful place, their necessary place in the reshaping of a brutal, brutal world. The problem is, you see, that right now, thanks to the exclusion of women from church as well as state, we see a crippled soul, a crippled mind, a half-hearted operation of the human race, and it shows day after day after day. We must begin then. We can't get degrees from institutions like this, carry them out and hang them on our walls if we have not consciously begun to see, rethink, reshape, and retell the story of Eve for who she really is. It's people like you and I who must first begin to understand that Eve is the graphic memory of the unaccomplished in the human race, a sign of what we have yet to do before humanity can become wholly whole again. More than that, Eve, the other image of God, is the clear picture of what God has not been allowed to be for any or for all of us. The equality of women with men has long been a subject of debate. Women are smaller physically, milder temperamentally, nurturers emotionally, and childbearers biologically. And this, quote, subordination of purpose and secondary matter, the philosopher Thomas Aquinas taught in the 13th century, affects her reason and moral discernment negatively. Now that's goodness to you, honey. Her reason affects her head and her goodness negatively, renders her unfit for the public domain. Now, you may not like what I say about Thomas Aquinas, but I'm kind to him. And if you don't believe me, you take out your bedside copy of the Summa Theologica tonight, and you just trace the sources on women. Anything I say will look mild. As a result, to this day, biblical fundamentalists point out that the male was created first, and that this primacy, therefore, is the mark of his superiority. No mention, of course, of the animals that preceded the creation of men. So much for the primacy argument, kids. They are very quick to note that Eve was derivative, formed out of the side of Adam. And yet it is precisely that rendering of the creation of Eve that stands in total contradiction to all of that kind of limited thinking. As Joyce indicated, for those of you who were here last night, you have to realize that in Genesis, in other words, in Hebrew, the word Adam is not Adam. It is Adamah. The Hebrew word is Adamah, and it means the earth person, the one who is either ungendered or both gendered. Now, do you understand what that's saying? If Adamah has no gender, if Adamah is simply in the Hebrew mind, human, the substance of humanness, then Adam does not exist until Eve exists. The creation of Adam and Eve is simultaneous. The extraction of one creates the other. It is not a question of seniority that we're dealing with. We have humanity in the naming process, humanity in the thinking process, and humanity that does not exist for itself. In Genesis, Adamah himself says of Eve, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Someone, in other words, just like me. Just like me. Someone just like Adam himself. Someone made out of the very same material. Someone with the very same substance. Someone absolutely identical to himself, if for no other reason than the DNA. Indeed, the story of creation is not at all obscure. The story of creation is very, very clear. Eve is obviously someone definitely not to be defined as other or lesser or inferior in quality. It is the same quality because it is the same substance. Eve, in other words, is the icon. Eve is the icon of the equality of women, not their subordination. Eve is also our sign, then, of possibility as well. If women and men are made of the same fabric, then women too are normative and unlimited in human potential. It is Eve, if it is anyone, who is full proof that women have both right and reason to expect that humanity, with all its blessings, as well as its burdens, is for them, as well as for men. What's more, Eve, the one to whose personality Adam succumbed apparently, is also a worrisome sign to men that it is not brute force that makes a human being strong. She didn't mug him, kids. It is an amalgam of personal and intellectual qualities brought to wholeness, brought to quality, that really measures the merit of a person, the strength of a person, and the value and effectiveness and influence of their lives. Eve is the non-physical force in the first human discussion. Eve is too, then, an icon of life in abundance, of life lived hard, but of life lived when it seemed that there was nothing left about it that was livable at all. To both women and men alike, Eve is the proof that life in us can go on, will go on, whatever its struggle, whatever its fragility. Eve failed, yes, but she did not give up. Eve made a mistake, that's true, but she did not give in to despair. Eve faced life and its apparent worst and kept on going. Mary Pickford wrote once, if you have made mistakes, there is always another chance for you. You may have a fresh start any moment you choose. For this thing we call failure is not the falling down, it is the staying down. Indeed, Eve is the proof for every berated woman after her that life can begin again because it lives in us with strength and struggle. If anything, Eve is sign to the rest of us, to all the rest of us, that it is in woman that life is kept and carried and brought to fullness, whatever the cost, whatever the struggle, to bear it, to maintain it, over and over and over again, that life in me is worth it. That woman is by nature, woman is by nature theological proof of God's continuing work in us. That God goes on creating in us. It's from women, after all, that we get the first glimpse of the fact that whatever the situation, creation does go on creating. It is through Eve, through women, that we come to realize the down-deep tenacity of life that clings to little, vague, small promises and survives. It's not because of her weakness, Eve shows us, that life should be reviled. It is because of weakness become indomitable that life must be revered. It is in Eve that the virtue of hope becomes real. What can be suppressed by the mighty of the world for their convenience and for their ends will be suppressed. But Eve, the other half of humanity, is stark illustration that God will not be controlled. That God will arise, will emerge, will be imaged in whom God wills. No doubt about it. Eve is our sign that God is not amenable to human limitations. The fact is that God is often where the powers of church and the potentates of the state refuse to see God. It is too often, isn't it, that God is in those which the systems call ungodly. The poor, the dirty, the ungracious, the unsophisticated, the unmale of the world, while it makes God to its own white, righteous, male image and likeness. But Eve is God's proof that God has plans for all of us that will not bow to the chains of those who have no plans for us at all. Indeed, in women everywhere, Eve is rising to begin again, full of life, an intelligent, unsung hope for the lowliest of the lowly of the world. The fact is that Eve is sign of the very nature of God. We shall make humanity, Genesis states, in our own image. Male and female, we shall make them. We shall make humanity in our own image. Male and female, we shall make them. God, clearly you see, by God's own testimony, which apparently is very poor authority and theology in Rome. is female. God is female as well as male. We shall make humanity in our own image. God is a woman's mind, a woman's sensitivity. God is a woman's body, a woman's understanding. God is a woman's creativity, a woman's sense of values. God, you see, is a woman's sense of principles. As long as Eve stands, God's truth stands there too. Womanly, feminine, full of life, no matter who chooses to try to repress it in any part of them. Finally, Eve is the first proof, the first witness we have of human freedom. It is Eve, after all, who, faced with alternatives, was given the right to choose. But choice then, like choice now, has consequences. What could have been easy without those choices becomes difficult, yes. What could have been obvious without those consequences becomes obscure, yes. What would have been guaranteed, apparently, without those choices becomes uncertain for all of us, yes. But in it all, Eve becomes an icon of the refreshing frailty of humankind, of humanity struggling to be fully human, of the process of slow growth that life brings with it to those intent on finding it, of the wisdom that is born out of an open mind, a wealth of experience, and a thirsty heart. Ask the oldest people in this assembly today whether or not life is not more life as the years go by. Eve did not sin because she hated life and God. Eve sinned because she wanted to live life to the fullest, however confused her perception of the way. Succeed she didn't, we sometimes think, but grow she did, we know. Our shining proof that the human being is capable of learning from errors and may even be intended to learn from errors. If the mystic Julian of Norwich is right about the necessity of sin in life, in her 13th shewing, which takes her 10 years to understand and to reflect upon and to proclaim, Julian of Norwich teaches what we have learned only partially. Almost every church I know, someplace along the line in their liturgy sings, "And all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Have you heard it? How many? Yes, you've heard it. But it's wrong. It's wrong. Go back to the original. The thing has been edited beyond any moral theological content that's valid. What Julian of Norwich saw in her showing was, sin is behoovable, and all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. If I tell you it would be good for you to leave here with your book bag, if I would say it is behoovable for you to take your book bag with you, what would I be saying to you? What does behoovable mean? It would be good. It would be necessary. It is right. Sin is behoovable. And all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Succeed Eve didn't, we sometimes think, but grow she did, we know. Our shining proof that the human being is capable of learning from errors and may even be intended to learn from errors, if the mystic Julian of Norwich is right about the place of sin in life. Indeed, it is Eve who shows us that by going on through difficulty, through failure, through sin, we can become even more than we were, when we started. An ancient monastic tale tells of a disciple who asked the old monastic, "But what do you do in a monastery?" And the old monastic replied, "Well, we fall and we get up, and we fall and we get up, and we fall and we get up again." Eve, the one whose sights became skewed, perhaps, is nevertheless the one God used to prove that the chance to begin again is one of God's greatest graces. That sin is no cause for despair. That struggle is not the end to life. That failure does not destroy the human. Eve is also a sign to us of how warped we are in our concept of the characteristics of the genders. It was Adam, after all, who failed to see beyond the present. It was Adam who simply stood by and said nothing, that great big rational hunk, while the serpent negotiated with Eve. You remember the pictures your second grade teacher put around on the top of the chalkboard of the story of creation and paradise? Where was Adam? Well, Eve was having her little discussion with you-know-who. Where was Adam? Come on, tell sister. Where was Adam? In the background, we say. All the pictures used to show Adam in, quote, another part of the garden. A very clever little transliteration, which in later editions has been more honestly rendered. And while they were both together in the garden, Scripture says, the serpent came and talked to Eve. He wasn't so dumb, he knew where he'd get an answer. Adam never even says, with his great claim to rationality, "Honey, let's hold on this decision till after supper. And try not to get hysterical about it, We'll think it through." And archaeologists tell us that we found 2 sets of teeth marks on the apple. Rational he may have been, sinless he was not. It was Adam who was dependent and irrational and easily duped. And when you look at the political, military, and economic decisions that have been being made ever since, you never doubt it. It was Eve who was leader in the lust for life. But nevertheless, given the present punitive reading and interpretation of what was a common sin, a common punishment, a common call to slow growth and ongoing human development in both the male and the female, we have frozen this scene at its lowest possible levels, woman the temptress and man the victim. And with those icons before our eyes, we have destroyed them both. We have turned men into physical, brutal avengers, and women into physical sex objects. Because of our warped interpretation of Genesis and our sickened theology of Eve, we have called half the human race brutish and the other half a commodity. As a result, women are the poorest of the poor and doomed to poverty because they cannot get the jobs, the promotions, the wages that are worth their effort and their skills as men do. As a result, as a direct result of a warped interpretation of the role of the sexes, men, the boys of our mother's kitchens, are taken out of their homes and trained to ruthless obedience, to torture in the name of good government, to mass murder in foreign deserts and Asian villages and whole cities in the name of goodness and democracy and freedom for all. As a result, women are sold and raped and beaten and burned for bride price to this very day, every single day, now, as you and I sit here and reflect without threat on threatening material. And worst of all, perhaps, most obscene of all, perhaps, in the face of creation, of the gospel, of good news for all people, women are excluded from the Holy of Holies in churches that call themselves the houses of God. As a result, there is no end to the effects of sexism on both men and women. No end to giving birth and denying birth to unwanted girl children. In Bombay, India last year, according to the World Watch report, of the 8,000 amniocenteses that were performed, 7,999 abortions out of those 8,000 amniocenteses were of female fetuses. There is no end to oppression in the name of God. No end to the devaluation of the female fetus to the day of her funeral. Eve may, in fact, be the most powerful icon of them all. If the world begins to see Eve as an icon of the feminine in God, then every single system is going to have to change. Every misogynist idea will have to bend. Every battened down door will have to open. Every sexist establishment will have to fall. Every negative and limited and manipulated religious teaching about women will have to blush in the sight of God. Every sexist lie will have to give way to the God of truth. Eve makes clear that systems based on male power structures and male God figures are at best, only half ever be used again to justify the exclusion of women from the seats of male power or the centers of male decision-making. If woman is the undeveloped resource of the Holy Spirit, then no door can be barred to her, at the peril of those who already occupy those centers of power and influence. If Eve can be seen for who Eve really is, establishments that operate without the feminine insight, any establishments that operate without the feminine insight and the feminine dimension of the Godhead, proceed at their own risk. And they are only limited versions of a human system, and at best, simply a whisper of what they could be with the presence of women, and what they should be with the presence of women, and what they must be with the presence of women, if God is ever to be fully glorified by us. Religions that build their scriptures and their doctrines and their sacraments of all things on a false theology of women face the heresy of propagating a false theology as well, for they preach a false God, a God who is not both female as well as male, not pure spirit, but male only, the new golden calf in the ecclesiastical desert. When a church is faced with making a decision between the sacraments and maleness, and chooses maleness in a sacramental church, that is a pathetic caricature of what the God of life must really be. Indeed, the icon Eve is stark and continuing, irritating, niggling, discomforting proof that truth dies, where women are subjected and dominated and oppressed, even benignly, and made invisible and struck dumb, where women are not both seen and heard. God is only partial. Insight is only partial. Truth is only partial. If Eve is an icon of the image of God, then every woman who tries to be heard about nuclearism and is not is a dimmed icon of the love of God. Every woman who asks for justice and is denied it because she is a woman is a faded icon of the equality of God. Every man who recognizes the feminine in himself but is forced to repress it in order to parley the machoism that passes for manliness is an icon of God become invisible, God become unwhole. Every relationship, professional, personal, and social, that depends on the headship of maleness is an icon of half a God. The real truth is that it is Eve who recalls us to our real selves, to our full selves, to our incompleted selves. Both of us, incomplete, male and female, incomplete, together and in themselves. It is Eve who makes the feminine as normative as the masculine. It is Eve who makes equality the measure of humanity. It is Eve who makes us mourn the limitations which we have put upon ourselves in the name of God. The fact is that Eve is icon of strength and hope, sign and light, star and promise to women around the world. And she challenges each of us here this morning in our homes and offices to be the same. But if Eve is as wholly human as Adam, then Eve's truth is that as long as one woman speaks anywhere, all women are freer everywhere. But that gives us a serious social problem then, when the story of Eve is allowed to be used against women. Women who have been taught on the basis of the Eve story to endure, told to accept their limitations, trained to be silent and led, have been brought up to deny their own strength and talent and opinions because Eve is devalued. They are devalued. The situation genteel, as it has become, normative as it is, unquestioned as it may be, is the worst of oppressions. Why? Because it takes something good and turns good into bad. For instance, who would doubt that there is strength in endurance, but there is also great strength in refusing to endure enslavement as well? Who would question that there is character in the acceptance of limits, but there is also character in refusing to be sinfully limited as well? Who would deny that there is value in a silence that weighs issues and reflects on consequences and refuses to stir up strife for the sake of conquest? But there is a violence in the silence that denies the truth of pain, or the cry of the poor, or the strangulation of the feminine in a society on the brink of disaster from the institutionalization of exclusively masculine values. There is violence in a silence that allows women the suffering women in our own families, across the country, throughout the entire world, to suffer with never a word from us. Not one demonstration about the rape hotels in Bosnia. Not one ad in the newspaper. Not one letter writing campaign. Not one teach in, sit in, pray in. There is great violence in a silence that allows the suffering women in our own families, across our countries, throughout the entire world, to suffer with never a word from us. It is time for women to refuse to be silent ever again. We must not be silent when our daughters are raped and beaten. That is slavery. We must not be silent when women are erased even from the pronouns of the language, even the language of the church. That is invisibility, bodilessness, dismissal, human erasure, and heresy. We must not be silent when our churches hold God hostage to sexism. You see, the problem with sexism is not what sexism says about women. If men or women say that women are stupid or slow or seductive, there's no doubt about that. I'm sure it's true. Why do I think it's true? Because God made women just like men. It's true. No, the problem with sexism is what sexism says about God. Sexism says that the God who could draw water from a rock and part the waters of the sea and raise the very dead to life goes limp in the presence of a woman. Sexism says that the feminine is the one factor in life in the face of which the power of God goes impotent. Sexism says that God made pink and blue souls, and they whirl around out there, and the pink ones leak. God says that women can get some graces, the sexist teaches, but not all graces. God says, the sexist says, that women can get grace, but they can never, ever be a channel of it. Sexism says that femaleness is the one fabric of creation, the one fabric of creation through which God cannot work and to which God does not call. The icon Eve, Mary of Nazareth, Mary of Magdalene, and the woman at the well notwithstanding. The problem with sexism, you see, is that sexism is a heresy. No, we must not be silent when our churches make maleness godlike and God male. That is heresy too. We must not be silent when our governments and our industries deprive women and therefore deprive children of the very means of life, but pour most of our money, most of our best minds, most of our resources into instruments of destruction rather than development. That is machoism of monstrous proportion. A country that wants jobs and infrastructure and health care now was silent. Stone cold silent. When that money went into masculine weapons of destruction rather than feminist programs for development. And that country leads the entire world with a machoist philosophy and investment. No, we must not be silent when the world is deprived of the feminine values of consensus and collaboration and compassion, in a time when the male values of conformity and coercion and conflict have clearly failed. Failed in Vietnam, failed in Cambodia, failed in El Salvador, failed in Nicaragua, failed in Somalia, failed in Bosnia, failed in the lives of women and children everywhere. Clearly, clearly failed. We must not be silent when the world is on the brink of its own destruction, when the exploitation of whole segments of the human race for the sake of the rest of the human race is taken for granted. We must not be silent. We must not be silent. We must not be silent when half the people of the world, women, are disenfranchised from the political, the economic, the social, and even the ecclesiastical decisions that affect not only their lives, but their very souls. My hope for the women of the world is that the women of the United States and Canada, its most educated population, competent, healthy, and strong, will become a common, loud, and compelling voice for voiceless women around this world, too clear to be ignored, too certain to be intimidated, too loud to be silenced, so that the violence of silence can end, if not for us, then because of us. The Chinese say very clearly, if we stay on the road we are on, we shall surely get where we are going. And Camus wrote once, the saints of our times are those who refuse to be either its executioners or its victims. May you and I then be for all the women of the world loud, loud, loud. Have no doubt about it. Women everywhere need a new and inspiring image of the Eve who is sign of the equality, intelligence, endurance, life, hope, free will, gender strength, and unlimited being of God. Women everywhere need the Eve in you. For their sakes, embrace her wholly. Raise her up proudly. Let her, for a change, live freely in you, in us, in this society, in this church. Let her live freely for a change, for a real change. And when the struggles are too deep and your gains are too meager and your own heart close to despair, remember, in this world and in this church, again, that nothing we do changes the past. That's true. But every single thing you do, every word you say, every smallest action that you perform changes the future. I want to thank all of you for caring enough to come, thinking enough to listen with such concentration, being brave enough to do something, some tiny, tiny thing in your own life to retell the story of Eve for the sake of all the unborn women in the world. Thank you again.
Sister Joan is willing to entertain a few questions or comments. We do have some mics in the center aisle. We would ask you, if at all possible, that you use those so that it can be taped, but don't let those deter you from responding in your seat if you think we can all hear. Some students I know may have had to leave because of next classes, but we understand that. Thank you. And don't be silent.
Sister Joan, I wonder if you would comment, based on your presentation, what your expectations would be of the synod that's just starting in Rome on consecrated life.
Well, thank you, I think. My mother thanks you, my father thanks. Part of me says my expectations are very limited. The other part of me says, thank God they're limited. And I'll tell you why. If out of old images, with no respect for Eve and for the feminine dimension of the will of God and the nature of God, if we go on making decisions for half of the human race based on very, very limited ideals, understandings, and theologies and biologies of the past, then I can't have high expectations. On the other hand, in all fairness, We have seen some change, some move. We do at least have 20 observers out of 279 or 90 council fathers, I guess. We do have a concern for religious life, which certainly I share. I am hoping, and I wrote an article in the States in February on the future of religious life, in which I end saying, actually, that my greatest hope is that we will not try to leap to answers prematurely, both about women and about religious life. The fact of the matter is that this is the one place where the church is clearly going against the flow of history and the tide of insight. My fear for the church, I had a bishop say to me once, Joan, in your opinion, how much time do we have left? And my answer was, Bishop, I know that you look at the Joan Chittisters of the world and you call us the troublemakers, the problems. But that's not true. I'll be buried in a Catholic cemetery, I imagine, if for no other reason than that my Irish Catholic mother would expect it. But we're not causing the trouble. We're simply belling the cat. We started 25 years ago to say it is here. Were we wrong? Were we wrong? No, we were not wrong. We stood then and said, you're at a watershed in history, you're at a crossover point, this must be attended to. Very little, if anything, has really happened. Now, when the bishop said to me, how much more time do we have? I said, I would keep my eyes, Bishop, on the women in first grade right now. That's all the time you have. And I'll tell you why. Because in the secular arena, whether or not the philosophical foundation is really internalized or not, structures are changing. Expectations are being raised. Men and women are learning to work together. Women are bringing a model of collaboration to the workplace as a substitute for models of authoritarianism. Men are learning from that. Men are finding that work is a gentler place to be like that. All sorts of things are happening out there. Yeah, there's a glass ceiling. Yes, there's a lot of hypocrisy. You bet tokenism is the name of the game. But the attitudes are changing. The expectations are changing. And young women really believe they can have it all. They believe it. Do you know that? They're wrong, but they believe it. I know, but seriously, I had a reporter in Houston say to me, Sister Joan, do you realize that there are very few young women in your audience? Doesn't that tell you that the women's movement is dead? And I said, oh, no, young man, on the contrary. That tells me that young women believe that the women's movement has succeeded. By the time they are between 35 and 40, they will discover that it has not. That it has not for them, not to the same degree that the system is oiled and functions for their brothers. I said, then you will have the best educated, most articulate, and most economically independent group of feminists that the world has ever known, and I beg you, beware. Because those women are going to come organized like a tank. And yet they will not be silent. Now put against that the history of the church. When these structures change and these expectations rise and this independence emerges, they're going to look at a church where only where God is are women not allowed. We have a hemorrhage going on in the church right now, my friends. It's not a revolution, it's a hemorrhage. The young women who bother to talk to me tell me how they were raised Catholic. You get the past tense? Or they were raised in a church, not necessarily Catholic. A number of evangelical denominations. I was that once. And they're silently disappearing over the hill. Do you follow what I'm saying? If we do not attend to the questions, the attitudes, the theology, if we don't, what is not in the language will never be in the structures. We know, you realize, and I think Barry said it last night, I'm a social psychologist by training, a communication theorist, basically. Communication theorists are very, very clear about the fact that language molds thought. We follow Krzyzewski quite a bit on that thinking, of course. We have given the underpinnings for therapeutic communication to the psychiatric and psychological community. And we believe very strongly that language identifies what is important to a people. So, for instance, the Eskimos, you will know better than I, they tell me, a minimum of 40 words for snow. They know exactly what kind of snow is falling because it affects the way they live their lives. We laugh, we say, my God, 40 words for snow, why, it's ridiculous, is it? Any American kid 6 years old has at least 40 words for automobile. He calls it Taurus, Honda, hatchback, Coupe de Ville. Do you see what I'm saying? The minute I say that word, you get a different picture. But when people like me say, we want two pronouns used in the church, in our hymns, in the liturgy, they tell us, isn't that hysterical? We're asking for one pronoun for the other half of the human race. And they tell us it's not important. Oh, Sister Joan, don't get so hysterical about that little stuff. That little stuff is my life. That little stuff is my creation. And you are very cavalier about it. That little stuff is existence. And if it doesn't mean anything, Father, if it's really unimportant, let's say Jesus came to save all women for the next 2,000 years. At least the word woman includes the word man, which is better than what they can say. They say to me, oh, now you know we mean you. Well, there's a seminary that sits down in Cleveland, and in the cement portal over the front door, it said, blessed are the young men who enter here. Am I to presume that that is the one seminary in the United States, then, that ordains women? They mean me when they say, blessed are the men who enter here. It's the one word in the English language where the oppressed and the unoppressed differ because the oppressed have to figure out if they're included in it or not. Or let's do it this way. Surely you can do this with me. Out loud, tell Sister. Hail Mary, come on. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst whom? Pardon me, would you say, blessed art thou? Why aren't we saying, blessed art thou amongst men, unless what we really mean is you did pretty well for second class? Oh, they know very clearly. It's very clear to them when they will use it and when they won't. When I grew up, we grew up saying, and Jesus, in the creed we prayed, and Jesus became, and the Word of God became what? Not when I grew up, flesh. And how many people in here prayed, and the Word of God became flesh? You bet you did. But in the last 20 years, all of the translations have been changed to say, and the Word became man. They know very clearly what they're doing. Don't you tell me they don't have a communication theorist on their staff. Do you see what I'm saying? If you never think it, you can't expect it. You can't see what you can't say. You'll never have a change in structures till you demand a change in language and use it yourself. To say that is unimportant is to say that the chain on your ankle has nothing to do with your imprisonment. Nothing we do will change the past. Everything we do will change the future. I'm going to let you go. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Sister Joan, I find no threat at all in the title like Sister Joan or Brother...
Joan would be just fine, thank you.
Brother John is fine. Father Harry has a different ring to it, though. You spoke a moment ago about the difference between 20 or so observers and the fathers of the council, succeeding the fathers of the church and so forth. I'm surprised not to find very much in the journalism about the significance, say the kind of effect that would come from the convention of father, which we use for priests. Have you a reflection on that?
Thank you very much for that. That's a very insightful intervention, and as a matter of fact, follows directly from the last one. Certainly, that is a very profound, element. A very meaningful one, but it only becomes meaningful. There's nothing wrong with the word father, any more than there's anything wrong with the word mother, sister, or brother. It only becomes an instrument of oppression when you destroy the spiritual nature of God. You see, if God is male, then males are closer to God. Do you see what I'm saying there? I'm sure you do. And so if you, let me give you this example. In the litanies of the church, in fact, the litanies that I prayed right through 4th grade, do you remember them? We went for the novenas and we prayed the long, long litanies. God was called Spirit, Dove, Wind, Door, Portal, Key. The Psalms are full of images for God, aren't they? I mean, in these 19th century litanies, there are literally dozens and dozens of images of God, but the church never, ever calls God Mother. Rock, boat, key, bird. But when a woman prays, God, our loving mother, God, our gentle Father, who art in heaven, the foundations rock. As long then, as this gentleman points out so well, as you maintain this concept of the fatherhood of God, and you limit that, and you refuse to embrace God as total being, then the term father becomes very, very subconsciously heavy. That's not necessary, nor is it to deride any priest who is father anybody. But it is to explain why some priests have felt the pain of that, have felt rejection, especially from women on that, who don't even know anymore how to introduce themselves. I have to tell you that sensitive and kind priests are in the position of liberated whites 25 years ago. I mean, I have fine black friends, but I don't understand most of what they tell me to do. The difference is I simply do it. If they tell me never to use the word Negro, I cannot stand up here and give you a decent lecture on why a black does not want to be called Negro. But do you know what? That's irrelevant. I don't have to be able to give that lecture. If I love as much as I say I love, I will simply not do it. So here you have men, feminist men, feeling very, very battered, wondering how they can stand in both worlds, how they can bridge this thing when the men laugh at them for having become wimps and women beat on their chests for not being strong enough. These are dark times. There is no real answer to that. I meant what I said. You know, as far as I'm concerned, I'm Joan, who happens to belong to a Benedictine community that I love dearly and that has fed my spiritual life and built my soul. But I worry about titles at this day and age, because with everybody struggling for a sense of existence around this whole world, better that we all start at point zero. Better that we all start out together than that we build into somebody else's mind some separation, some caste here. So there are some professional credentials. If I need them to get into ball games, I'll use them. Thanks so much. I'll see you this afternoon.
I hope you have noticed that Joan is wearing a kilt in Nova Scotia. Yes. I thank you for staying, and I invite you, if at all possible. We do have some good habits. So I would invite you, if at all possible, to come back this afternoon when Sister Joan will address the topic, New World, New Church, political, pastoral, or prophetic. Thank you. Good morning.